So I couldn't believe the New York Times covered this. It's not something you see very often, but here's the title of the article, and it kind of sums it all up. They married, divorced, and then married their ex-spouse again.
Mm-hmm.
They did couple profiles of this. And then reminded us in the intro about famous people who've done this. I didn't realize it had happened, but here we go. Famous couples who marry, divorce, and then remarry their former spouses are often fodder for tabloid headlines. Think of the actors Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton,
Mm-hmm.
who were, and the young people are like, who?
Yeah, I thought Tim Burton.
Is that Tim's dad? I don't know. They were married to each other twice. First for a decade, beginning in 1964, and then again in 1975, before they divorced the next year. That's a lot. Then there's Elon Musk and Tallulah Riley. They were wed from 2010 to 2012, and then again from 2013 to 2016.
So both of those were short gaps in between their marriages.
Right.
Interesting.
But I'm predicting Lauren will get excited about this next one. But not all remarriages fall. The celebrity TV justice Judith Sheindlin.
I love Judge Judy.
I knew it! I knew it! Judge Judy. She's, of course, better known as Judge Judy, married Jerry Sheindlin. He used to have a court show for a while.
Judy and Jerry.
He was the host of People's Court for a short time. Why do I know? Because I loved People's Court when I was a kid. I don't know why. I just loved it. Judge Wapner was my favorite, but he's been gone for a long time. They were first married in 1977. They divorced in 1990 and then remarried in 91, and they're still in wedded bliss today.
No, so they divorced in 90.
Remarried in 91.
Oh, wow.
They kind of like, boy, this was clearly a mistake of some sort, and then they got back together, or they fell in love again. I don't know what it was, but I would never want to make her mad. I can tell you that.
No.
You're an idiot!
That's a good Judge Judy impression.
You're a liar!
Wow.
And when she looks at Bert, right, is her, that guy, he's got...
The bailiff.
The bailiff.
I think he's my favorite.
Oh, boy, yeah. He doesn't have to say a word.
You know, she has a new series.
What?
Yeah. I can't remember. Ooh, I'll have to look it up. Maybe it's on HBO.
What's she doing?
I'm sure. Same thing.
Same thing. I forget what it's called.
Yeah, it's like
Judy Justice,
Judy
is that
Justice.
it?
Judy
Yeah.
Justice, yeah.
She could spot a liar from 100 yards, you know, that woman. And then there's singer and actress Marie Osmond, whom Ron, I'm sure, had a giant crush on.
Oh, yeah.
Of like the Osmond siblings.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, she was the girl. That girl. Among all those boys.
And she was married to motivational speaker Steve Craig. They were first married in 1982, divorced in 85. They remarried in 2011.
Oh, wow.
That's a long gap.
Yeah, and they're still married today. Miss Osmond told People magazine in 2019, she said, "The thing about a second marriage is that you realize things you thought were so important aren't." Now, precise figures about how often this happens, where people marry their ex-spouse again, there's varying statistics, not a lot of great research. Anywhere from 6 to 10% of remarriages are to an ex-spouse.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's not insignificant.
Right. I know they made it sound small in there, but I was like, wow, that's actually a lot.
Yeah, I figured it would be pretty rare. Like, I hate your guts and we never speak again.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder, too, like so many of them were like 1 year off and then they got remarried. But Marie Osmond and Steve Craig were a significant gap of time in there. I wonder, do they try another marriage and then realize, you know, maybe the first guy wasn't so bad and go back if how much of that happens?
Yeah, it is a strange phenomenon, right? You're like, okay, so why does this happen? And so what the New York Times did is they highlighted 6 couples who've done this and heard their stories and shared it all, which I thought was pretty interesting. And in fact, you can probably predict why people divorced, to be honest. Like, there was nothing super surprising about any of the people they highlighted. For example, there's Leslie and Val. And when you get to the part about their divorce, it says, but as their family grew, beginning with the birth of the first of their 2 sons in February 1998, their relationship started to come apart. She wanted that they had different religious traditions. She was Jewish, she's Muslim. She wanted a bris, he wanted done in a hospital, and that just kind of exemplified their differences. We thought we were so in sync, she said, and we started to see that there were vast differences in expectations. Eventually, their relationship had had no conflict-free zones, and they just kind of fell apart. They just drifted. But it happened with birth of a child. Pretty stressful. And then, I mean, when it describes their reconnection, it says one evening about a month after they were officially divorced, he showed up at her apartment to pick up their sons for a usual Wednesday dinner with them. He asked if she'd like to come along. She agreed and continued to join Wednesday night dinners. She said, we laughed a lot. And she said we'd gone through a nightmarish divorce and now we couldn't take our eyes off each other. They just kind of reconnected.
Mm-hmm.
Probably that original spark came back when they didn't have the conflict anymore.
Right.
And that essentially is the story of every single person in this article. Like, for example, here's another one. You have Lauren and Larry Sussman. Mr. Sussman's 2 boys, age 12 and 14, and Miss Sterling's 2 girls, age 13 and 17, blended so effortlessly that the couple decided to merge their families under one roof and married in 2005. 7 years later, they began divorce proceedings. During their marriage, they devoted most of their attention to their full-time jobs and house full of teenagers. And then he said it was a marriage centered on family, which caused it to fall apart.
What age were the kids all when they met and got together?
One set, 12 and 14, the other 13 and 17.
Wow. So it was, you're merging all teenagers, 4 teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
So what they focused on was 4 teenagers
Yeah.
and careers.
And you wouldn't have time for developing the relationship that typically when you're married with no children, you've got a lot of time there to grow in understanding each other. Well, they didn't. It was just right into the fire.
She said they were missing, quote, the original reason we got married, our emotional connection. Think about how often that happens. Here's another one. Then you have Jean and Ronnie. They moved to a new town where they bought 5 acres on which they planned to build a house. In the meantime, a rickety trailer served as their home. She said, I didn't know anybody. I was away from my mother for the very first time, super far away. I was working all the time at my job, he said, as a railroad engineer, leaving her at home. How cool. I never met an actual engineer.
Choo-choo.
He was gone, she was lonely, and they divorced. And they reconnected later because they had shared custody of their 6-month-old Great Dane.
Oh, wow.
Whatever works to bring them back together.
Right. So are you seeing there's not a cataclysmic reasons for divorce? It's like, we talk about this all the time. The way the Lord designed marriage, it's supposed to be first your heart belongs to Jesus, heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then you focus on your spouse. And then comes your family, your kids and your dog and your career and all that. And when it's out of whack, things fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
It's a slow drift.
Yeah. But people end up getting remarried, which I think is fascinating. And it goes, I think, to the heart of God. We don't talk about divorce a lot around here, but it's worth touching on. Now, before the break, we were chatting about, I thought, a really surprising and pro-marriage article from the New York Times. They highlighted the idea of there are a percentage of couples that after divorce marry their ex-spouse. And I wanted to make sure we cover this a little bit from a faith perspective. Again, to remind you, if you're divorced, you're welcome here. I think far too often the church is an unwelcoming place for divorced people. It's not a scarlet letter. It's, we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. Not everything works out. And in some cases, it's not sin that you got divorced. Mm-hmm. And that's where I also want to throw this one down, just to have us think about it. There's a lot of Christian people, a significant number, who are in dead marriages with no connection, but they're not getting divorced because they're Christians. How does God feel about that, do you think? I have my predictions, but you think God likes that? Like, you just technically are not divorced. Good for you. I'm happy now.
Yeah.
I don't think Jesus ever let anyone go on a technicality.
Right.
I mean, the Bible says if you think hate towards your brother, you've killed them.
Yeah, and there's expectations of how you behave in a marriage. Like, look at Ephesians 5. If you're not living that out, what do you think? God's cheering for you because you're technically not divorced? I think of my maternal grandparents. Lived in different bedrooms for decades. He was so rude to her. They never spent time together. Mm-hmm. Their marriage was dead. Oh, but they weren't divorced, so whee! So,
But they're not trying. They're not trying to find joy and, love with one another. They're just living the same house.
And marriage is supposed to be a symbol for what our relationship with Jesus looks like.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
if we're not caring for our marriages, that is just not being true to what God intended for it to be.
Exactly. Yes. And this is where I think a lot of folks get it wrong. I love that Dr. Rydelnik has highlighted this for us. But of course, for those who want to hear it, there are actually biblical reasons where divorce is allowed. Generally speaking, it's sexual immorality and abandonment. Most modern scholars would include abuse and abandonment. And you have an easy way to explain that, I think, don't you?
Well, you've abandoned your vows.
Yeah.
So they've already left you because they've left the things that they've promised to you at your wedding ceremony.
Yeah. And so, there's a number of passages about this, but I think Matthew 19 is one of the better ones. It says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went down to the region of Judea, east of the Jordan River. Large crowds followed him, and he healed their sick. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question. Should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Haven't you read the scriptures? He replied. They record that from the beginning, God made male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. And then he stopped talking. And they said, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? Jesus said, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts. But it is not what God had originally intended. And I tell you this, whomever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. And I think what we miss in this, a lot of people don't want to talk about, is that the Lord's heart's for reconciliation. The Lord's heart is for what these couples in the New York Times did. Whether or not it's, get divorced and get remarried, it's to stay married. One of the more surprising statistics I found, because you might go like, well, but he allows for divorce for infidelity, for example. So you should that's when you get divorced. When you look up statistics, if couples enter therapy after an incident of infidelity or a season of infidelity, up to 80% of marriages survive. Do you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
That's incredible.
I mean, it depends on what statistics you look at. One would say whether or not counseling is involved, about 54%. But when counseling is involved, 60 to 80% of marriages survive. And that's just a secular statistic. So God's heart is for reconciliation. Yeah. And Dr. Rydelnik talks about this too, where if, even in a difficult circumstance, if someone is unrepentant and refuses to stop, well, okay, fine. They've hardened their heart, as Jesus would say, and divorce is your only choice, really. Or if somebody totally abandons you or refuses to stop abusing you or something, okay, well, you have no choice. But if they're sorry and repentant and want to reconcile, that's God's heart, is to allow that to happen. Now, it's hard, though, right? And I think the challenge comes in when we don't realize that we really are to be people of reconciliation. We forget the purpose of the gospel itself is that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us anyway, that we might be reconciled to him. We didn't deserve the reconciliation, but he did it anyway. And that's where we have to exemplify that in our lives. And I remember I was an elder of a church when I was in my 20s. One of my kids leaned over to me yesterday. We had an elder up front doing announcements who's probably almost 30. She goes, why is he called an elder? He's young. And I chuckled. My radio handle at that church where I was an elder was Brian, the younger elder, because I was like 26. Don't ever call me that now, because you wouldn't anyway.
No,
So
would never dare.
I'm getting too old for that. But I remember there was a guy lived right across the street from the church, started attending the church. His marriage was falling apart, and he asked for prayer. And I pulled him aside. The two of us started praying, and I said, I asked the Lord to intervene in their relationship, and if it would be God's will that they be reconciled to one another. And if not, and then I prayed some other things. At the end, he looked at me and he goes, why did you do that? I have no interest in reconciling. He was so offended that I said, I was like, well, that's God's heart. Oh, he was upset, and he walked away.
What did he want, I wonder?
Yeah, what did you want prayer for?
He wanted to pass, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think he wanted like a blessing of sorts. Like, yes, off you go, divorce.
Mm.
So, I don't know. How do we move forward with this kind of attitude? Because I think I see far too often people miss the reconciliation piece, God's heart for it. How do we change the church culture that we be people of reconciliation? And if you want to know more about that, 2 Corinthians 5, go read it. It talks all about that we have a ministry of reconciliation as Christians. I don't know how we do this.
I think modeling it is a good place to start. I know there are people with some like deep church hurt and you have to get out, but I think we are too quick to leave churches where we've built up friendships and relationships, and these are like our family. So I think just starting small with not bailing on your church the second there's something you don't like is a good place to start. Yeah,
absolutely. And I would say we really have to do better with marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Like we truly, I think, again, I've had a psychologist tell me that works in marriage counseling, said that probably about 10% of Christian marriages are really healthy and thriving. That's terrible. Again, if you think you've somehow won a prize because you're still married, but you're functionally speaking really not connected to your spouse, that's not good. You're not modeling anything. I think we have a lot of Christian families that do not have their priorities straight. The kids are the center of their family life and their marriage. And that's not healthy either. I think before we get all wound up about divorce, we got to do marriage better.
Yeah. Pastors can more often acknowledge that that there are difficulties within marriage and specifically call them out. Like I've heard my pastor say on occasion, you guys were probably arguing with each other or yelling at the kids as you pulled into the parking lot today, weren't you?
Yep.
And that's real life. And so why not acknowledge that and then, say how we can improve on that. And churches can also, you often have a seminar with some speaker or other come in. Why not somebody who's an expert on marriage who can come in and help, guide you in a marriage tune-up? It doesn't have to be like a whole weekend. It could be just, a 2-hour seminar, and you could have them back multiple times, different topics, but invest in the marriages in your congregation.
Yeah. And really soak in, those of you who are having a hard time in your marriage, that the heart of the Lord is one of reconciliation. He wanted you to reconcile with him,
Mm-hmm.
And so don't view the exceptions that are listed in Scripture as your pass to get out. View reconciliation as the goal if it's at all possible, because it is possible.